The war in Europe had ended, but its shadows lingered across the continent. Cities lay in ruins, families were torn apart, and millions of soldiers and civilians alike found themselves in the uncertain aftermath of a conflict that had scarred every corner of human life. Among the displaced were German women who, captured in the chaos of surrender, were transported far from the rubble of their homeland to camps in America. They arrived expecting the harshness of captivity, fearing hunger, humiliation, and the iron grip of victors who would surely repay cruelty with cruelty. But what awaited them was something far different. One summer morning, as the rising sun poured gold across the quiet American horizon, the women were led to a long wooden table inside the camp's mess hall. The smell met them first, warm, rich, and impossibly comforting. Fresh bread, its crust golden and still steaming from the oven. Beside it, slabs of creamy butter, pale and glistening under the light. The sight alone was almost unthinkable for women who had lived through years of scarcity, where every meal in Germany had become a reminder of deprivation, and bread was rationed into meager, stale portions. They stared in disbelief. This could not be real. Prisoners of war were not meant to eat better than their families at home. Yet here it was before them, abundance, generosity and dignity laid out on a table. Their hands trembled as they reached for the bread, their eyes filling with tears as the soft loaf broke open, releasing steam that carried with it the impossible memory of life before the war. For these women it was not just food, it was mercy. The shock of that first meal was overwhelming. These women had been conditioned by years of Nazi propaganda to believe that capture by the Americans would mean harsh labor, meager scraps, and humiliation. Instead, the offering of fresh bread and butter cut through every fear they had carried across the ocean. It was an unspoken message. Here, even prisoners were treated as human beings. The bread was soft, the butter rich, and for a moment it felt as though time had reversed, pulling them back into kitchens of childhood before the world had collapsed. The act of eating became both surrender and salvation. They had stepped into the mess hall with heavy steps, every sound of their shoes against the wooden floor echoing like judgment. Their uniforms were worn, their hair tangled, their faces pale with exhaustion after days of transport. Captivity was not freedom. They knew this, but the weight in their stomachs was heavier than the chains of defeat. Hunger was no stranger. Bread in Germany had long been grey, coarse and rationed, stretched with fillers that made each bite a reminder of scarcity. Meat was a rarity, butter nearly mythical, and even the simplest vegetables had become treasures hidden in bombed-out markets. They braced themselves for more of the same, watery soup, stale crusts, a bare minimum of survival. But when the doors opened and the smell reached them, the air itself seemed to change. The rich, warm scent of yeast and flour lingered in the hall like a promise they dared not believe. Some froze at the threshold, unsure if this was a cruel trick meant to toy with their minds. Others stepped forward, their eyes scanning the table laid before them. Loaves of bread, round, golden, their crusts cracked from the oven's heat, sat waiting. Next to them, blocks of butter gleamed in the morning light, smooth and pale, cut into thick portions that seemed impossible in a time when most of their homeland had forgotten what real butter even looked like. The women exchanged glances, silent but heavy with disbelief. They whispered to one another in hushed German, their voices trembling. Could this be real? Their captors stood nearby, not with whips or rifles raised in cruelty, but with calm order, gesturing toward the tables as if inviting guests rather than controlling prisoners. For many of the women, the strangeness of kindness was almost harder to bear than the threat of punishment. Kindness felt dangerous. It broke through defenses. It stirred emotions buried beneath layers of bitterness and fear. When the first sat down, her hands shaking as she reached for the loaf, all eyes followed. She pressed her fingers against the crust, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. She tore the bread apart, steam curling upward into the air, carrying the unmistakable fragrance of life. She hesitated for a moment, looking around as if someone might snatch it away. then dipped her knife into the butter. The blade sank easily, spreading the pale richness across the bread's soft interior. She raised it to her lips, and as she bit into it, her eyes filled with tears. It was not just food, it was memory. It was her mother's kitchen. It was mornings before school. It was laughter echoing across a table that no longer existed. Around her, others followed. Some ate slowly, reverently, as though afraid the bread might vanish if consumed too quickly. Others devoured it with desperation, unable to resist the hunger that had plagued them for months. The room filled with the quiet sound of chewing, the breaking of crust, the clatter of knives against plates. But above all, it filled with silence, the silence of astonishment. Not a single voice mocked or jeered, not a single guard ripped the food away. Instead, they were left to eat, to taste, to feel. Tears fell freely. Some tried to hide them, lowering their heads so their hair covered their faces, but others wept openly, bread still clutched in trembling hands. One whispered that she hadn't tasted butter in years. Another murmured that her child back home had forgotten its taste altogether. For the first time since being captured, their bodies relaxed, their shoulders eased, their eyes softened. It was a moment of fragile humanity. The contrast was unbearable. Just weeks earlier, these same women had walked streets of ruins in Germany, where starving families lined up for hours for a crust of stale bread. They had watched children dig through rubble in search of scraps. They had gone to bed with hollow stomachs, their dreams filled with hunger that never ended. And now, across an ocean as prisoners of the enemy, they were given what their own people could not provide: abundance. It was, in its quiet way, a defeat far more profound than the fall of cities. The propaganda had insisted that America was decadent, selfish, cruel. Yet here was the truth, laid bare on a table. Their enemy fed them better than their leaders had. Each bite was a confrontation with that reality, and each swallow carried with it the bitter knowledge that everything they had been told was a lie. But it also carried something else: hope. The meal lasted less than an hour, but it etched itself into their memories for a lifetime. When the bread was gone, and the butter spread thin across empty plates, the women sat in silence, the echoes of their experience settling in. They had entered the hall as prisoners, defined by loss, fear, and propaganda. They left with something different, a strange, humbling awareness that even in captivity, dignity could be restored. It was not victory they tasted in that bread, nor humiliation. It was mercy, and mercy in that moment was more powerful than any weapon they had ever known. To many of these women, the meal was more than sustenance. It was a confrontation with their own shattered expectations. They had braced themselves for punishment, but instead were met with dignity. Some later recalled that the bread and butter reminded them of their mothers, of Sundays before the war, of homes that no longer existed. The simplest meal became the deepest wound and the deepest healing all at once. It was not the taste alone, but the realization that kindness could come even from those they had been taught to hate. The moment they sat at the long wooden tables, something inside them began to shift. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, but there was another ache, an ache deeper, sharper, born of years of fear and indoctrination. For as long as they could remember, they had been told that Americans were monsters, that if captured, they would be starved, beaten, forced into degrading labor. They expected cruelty, because cruelty was what war had taught them to expect from enemies. Yet here, in the simple offering of bread and butter, was the destruction of that myth. Every bite said something words could not. You are human even here. You are not forgotten. The taste unlocked memories long buried beneath the rubble of war. For one, it was the smell of her mother's kitchen on a Sunday morning, sunlight streaming through lace curtains, the table set with bread just out of the oven. For another, it was the laughter of children, her younger siblings smearing butter clumsily across thick slices as they argued over who would get the crusts. For yet another, it was the memory of her wedding day, when guests had gathered around platters of bread and butter, celebrating a union now fractured by war. These fragments of the past flooded back with a force that left many of them in tears. The hall was not filled with chatter or the rowdy noise of soldiers. Instead, it became a sanctuary of silence. The clinking of knives against plates was muffled by the weight of memory. A few women covered their mouths as they chewed, not to hide their hunger, but to shield the sobs that rose unbidden. They had not expected to feel this vulnerable in captivity, yet the generosity of their captors stripped away the armor they had carried with them. For some, the experience was unbearably painful. To taste such richness in captivity, while knowing that their families back home were scraping for scraps, felt almost cruel. A mother thought of her children, left behind in a city of ruins, their bellies empty. The bread in her mouth tasted of guilt, not only relief. She wanted to savor it, yet each swallow was heavy with the thought that her loved ones had none. Her tears dripped onto the crust, mingling grief with gratitude. The symbolism of the bread and butter grew larger than the act itself. It became a mirror, forcing them to see the lies they had believed. The men who had led Germany to war promised glory, but had delivered hunger. They promised strength, but had led them into defeat. And here from the enemy came compassion. For many of the women, it was this moment, not the surrender of generals or the signing of treaties, that truly marked the end of the war. War was not over until mercy was offered, and here it was, warm in their hands. The guards and cooks moved quietly among them, not with scorn, but with efficiency and patience. Some of the women dared to look up, to meet the eyes of the Americans serving them. What they saw was not hatred, but something calmer, something steadier. It was as if the meal itself carried a message. We have won, but we will not humiliate you. You have lost, but you will not starve. The power in that message was profound. To feed an enemy was to declare victory not only on the battlefield, but in the heart. Stories of that meal would ripple outward, retold among the women in whispers. Years later, some recounted it to their children and grandchildren. They would say that in that moment they understood for the first time what true power looked like, not power that destroys, but power that chooses mercy when cruelty is possible. And in their retellings, the details never faded. The golden crust breaking in their hands, the butter melting into the bread, the taste of a world that seemed lost but was suddenly alive again. It was the simplest of meals, yet it carried the weight of an entire war. It wounded because it reminded them of everything they had lost. It healed because it reminded them of everything they could still hope for. It was bread and butter, but it was also dignity, humanity, and the fragile beginning of reconciliation. In that quiet hall, the offering of bread and butter became symbolic, a gesture of America's power, not through cruelty, but through abundance. It reminded the prisoners that while their homeland crumbled, this nation remained strong, able to share even with those it had fought. The women, humbled and shaken, carried that memory long after their captivity ended. For many, it was the moment they realized the war was truly over, not because guns had fallen silent, but because mercy had been given. The symbolism of the bread reached far beyond its taste. To the German women who sat at those tables, it was a revelation. In Germany, bread had become an emblem of suffering. Long lines at bakeries, empty shelves, darkened kitchens, and ration cards defined daily life. The loaves that once smelled of warmth and family had turned into harsh, dry remnants of a world destroyed. But here, across the ocean, the bread carried an entirely different meaning. It was not rationed, not fought over, not stretched thin with fillers. It was fresh, whole, golden, and plentiful. It was a message written in flour and fire. You have lost, but you will not be broken. The butter, too, was not just food. It was luxury. In Germany's darkest years, butter was replaced by substitutes, pale, flavorless spreads that bore no resemblance to the richness remembered from childhood. The women had learned to forget its taste, to lower their expectations, to swallow disappointment with every meal. But here in the heart of captivity, butter returned not as a dream, but as reality. It melted across warm bread like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It was not simply nourishment, it was proof that abundance could exist even in the shadow of war. And in this act, America revealed something profound. Victory was not measured only in captured cities or surrendered armies. True victory was shown in the ability to give, not to take, to restore, not to destroy. By placing bread and butter before the prisoners, the Americans declared a philosophy without words. Strength does not need cruelty. Power does not require humiliation. In fact, mercy can weigh heavier than punishment. The women realized this truth not through speeches or propaganda, but through the quiet, undeniable reality of food on their plates. The hall itself seemed to breathe with symbolism. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the edges of the bread loaves and turning them into symbols of hope. The air carried the warmth of ovens rather than the smoke of destruction. The women looked around, and for the first time in years, they were in a place not defined by rubble or despair. It was still a prison camp, yes, but it was orderly, clean, and alive with the smell of sustenance rather than death. That contrast was unbearable and comforting all at once. Some of the women bowed their heads, whispering prayers of gratitude, not to the victors, but to God or fate, or whatever power had allowed them to taste mercy. For them, this was not merely food, but a sacrament, a moment that touched something spiritual. Bread had always been sacred, tied to survival, tied to life itself. And now it carried another weight. It was forgiveness without words, healing without demands. As the meal ended, none of them left unchanged. They returned to their barracks with bellies full, but more importantly, with hearts unsettled. What did it mean that their enemy showed them compassion? What did it mean that in defeat they had tasted more kindness than in years of loyalty to their own leaders? The questions gnawed at them, forcing them to reconsider everything they had believed. Some resisted the thought, clinging to anger. Others embraced it, finding hope in the possibility that the world could be rebuilt not only through strength, but through generosity. For many, the memory of that bread and butter never faded. When they returned to Germany after the war, when they walked again among ruins and tried to rebuild shattered lives, they carried the image of that mess hall inside them. It became a story they told their children. A story that lived longer than battle reports or political speeches. They said we were prisoners, but we were fed. We were defeated, but we were not humiliated. We were shown that mercy is stronger than hate, and perhaps, in the long years that followed, that memory planted seeds of change. Seeds of reconciliation, seeds of understanding, seeds that would one day allow former enemies to stand together in peace. For mercy, once given, has a way of lingering.